You asked me who benefited. That was one of your things.
Well, that was the
that
one
was the
before.
previous question.
Or maybe two. No, it's like okay. So we are not looking for a situation where we don't actually know how to pay our rent.
Yeah.
But also we don't want to fight for things that we just left behind, like being an employee in a company with 40-hour job. That puts us in a difficult situation, knowing that that what we were looking for actually is.
Okay, that gives me some clues, because one way that I could look at this is to say, well, I've worked in an office and I didn't like working in an office. Okay, I've done this stuff and I work in my own office, but I don't like working in other people's offices. Now, this is probably because I have a background in fine art, I think it kind of ruins you for the rest of your life in terms of being an employee. Okay, so you end up in this rather with a different skill set from most people who are willing to who have learned to adapt their behaviours to that kind of management structure. But part of me thinks that what's buried in your question is that everybody loves the idea of being a freelancer and being cool and having a sort of working part-time and not really getting paid properly and being a bit rock and roll and a sort of entrepreneur. Now, one thing that has always struck me is that if you want to sell the deregulation of labour markets as a politician to a population that doesn't want to be deregulated because it won't get health care, it won't get a pension, it won't get a reasonable income, and it won't be able to have a family because it won't have enough money to have a family, how do you sell it? And if you say it's creative, or it's a portfolio career, it sort of sounds nice.
So we all trapped in the same, or we all went into the same trap.
Well, one thing is I think that artists have to be kind of careful of is being manipulated by people who are sort of good with language and good at manipulating things. And the language that we have to talk about culture can be very easily manipulated into talking about business economics. And what strikes me about a lot of the conversation today is that there's a lot of conversation really about what are called business school economics rather than sort of macroeconomics or political economy, if you're a Marxist, right? Which seem to be the more interesting questions for me intellectually. A lot of it, conversation on the last panel was about, how do you support, we've got, there's collaboration and there's sort of some incubator units and, the usual stuff that I hear every conference that I go to about the creative industries. So in some ways, young artists or young creative people who are doing something, I call them practitioners rather than creators, but I have an art practice or a writing practice or a music practice, but I don't think of myself as creative. If you have a kind of practice, I think then you need to think about what is in it for other people when they tell you something about yourself. Right? If somebody tells you that you're creative or that what you're doing is cultural industries, why are they telling you that? Think critically about why that is, because you may not actually agree with it. You may think it's a bad idea. Now, having said all this, and your tape is running a long time and I'm talking a lot, one thing that has changed in the time that I've been involved in this, I got interested in copyright around 1994, 95, is that there was a big international agreement called the TRIPS Agreement, which came into force, I think it was agreed in 1994 and came to enforcement in most countries in 1996. I hope I got that right. Which was basically an international trade treaty on, it's called trade-related aspects of intellectual property. Copyright is part of that. Now, at that time that treaty came into being, a lot of developing countries really had no means of using that law. It was really, the treaty was designed by mainly European, North American and Japanese who had industries that had grown up in relation to copyright, which they wanted to protect in a global market. And so if a country in Africa had an intellectual property system, then you could sell the stuff there because it just couldn't then be ripped and redistributed.
And if it wasn't, you better don't.
Yeah. Now what's really changed, and what is changing quite quickly, is that a lot of developing countries, partly because of what's happened in the World Intellectual Property Organization, a lot of developing countries see their future as being involved with the creative industries. I mean, this concept was part of a raft of economic ideas that was supposed to put a wedge between the developed world and the underdeveloped world, right, economically. That we were supposed to be the brains, the innovators, and they were supposed to be the body who did the manual work. Right? This was the big idea of knowledge economics as a political program. What's happened is that the body is not prepared to be pushed around by the mind. And so they're starting to develop very slowly and with a good deal of problems their own kind of industries that can make use of these laws that they've signed up to. Now, I don't know enough, and I don't think anybody knows enough as to whether this is a good idea or a bad idea. All I know is it is happening. And countries, for example, in the Caribbean are very interested in using the laws now to protect their economies against multinational corporations who they regard as poaching on certain cultural ideas or cultural expressions. So the ideas that I had when I started in the mid-90s, everything is so much more complicated. I used to think I knew where to stand, and now I don't. The world is just, Jesus, I look at this thing and this thing, is that? Whose agenda is this? Whose agenda is that? Like, I don't know. I can't work it out. I don't have enough information. Yeah. So this is, and this comes back to the thing about if you're young and you're like 25, I'm old. I'm like 45, and I've been around a bit, and I'm rather cynical. If you're young and 25, you need to develop a little bit more of a cynical attitude. It's like, who is trying to get you to march in which direction? Yeah. So I think it's political awareness in some ways, rather than trying to say to people. I mean, I don't want to tell people which way to vote or what kind of political activity to have. Some people in the conference I know will want to do that, but I want people to be aware of how the structures work. I met a museum director 2 years ago who couldn't differentiate between the government and the state, and it absolutely shocked me because he's as old as me. And I said, well, if you don't really understand the difference, then how can you have any political idea? It's just, I was stunned because he's a very educated man. So I think some basic education about how the state is supposed to work, how the markets are supposed to work, how democracies are supposed to work, what other systems are there. Some education in that in the art world, I think, would be very good before you start thinking about copyright, creativity, and the cultural industries, because they all have agendas to do with particular kinds of corporations pushing claims and particular kinds of governments pushing claims. So on the one hand, if you're anti-copyright and you're an investor in the internet service providers or search engines, you put money into their shares, you will benefit from file sharing, because that business model of those corporations is based on people file sharing, having content to share for free on the internet. And if you have your shares in the copyright industries, you all hate that. Okay, so you have to be aware that when somebody comes and says, this idea is great or this idea is great, that maybe there are two big business blocks who are fighting each other, and you could be sandwiched between them. And I think this is sort of what I've come to realise in my own work, is that I worked in copyright reform. I've come to realise how much of that debate was manipulated by another set of corporations to their own business interests. So I'm kind of, this is what I mean about not really knowing which way is up. I'm very confused. And so somebody says, well, what do you think about copyright? Well, the principle seems fine, but it does seem that I've got some evidence in this report, this piece of academic work, that says the terms are definitely too long, and it seems to prove that, and I will go with that till I find something that says maybe that isn't right. Yeah. But I'm always very careful as to who is trying to get me to do something and why. So that's my paranoia.
Okay. So do you find orientation sometimes?
Or do I find
some kind of orientation sometimes, like a feeling, or like?
Well, I don't. I get some. I get. I get very. Sometimes I wish I got involved. Like I said at the start, I used to teach theory. Okay, one of the problems with teaching theory is I never talked about art because you get so involved in teaching people about Derrida or Baudrillard or Foucault, or Deleuze, you stop talking about art completely. I then, to get out of that, I sort of got into law and economics around culture, and now I'm very bored with that too. Mm-hmm. In some ways, I wish and this is maybe the romantic in me, is that I wish we could go back to talking about art in terms other than law and economics. And I think, and critical theory. I think, and that doesn't mean to say that we have to go back to Kant and judgment and aesthetics of taste and things like that. But there has to be some other way to think our way through art. It strikes me that the law can answer certain questions, economic theory can answer certain questions, critical theory can answer certain questions. But there's all sorts of other things that you experience in life that become more obvious as you get older that can't be broken down into those methodological approaches. And what art used to do was help us to at least try and think about those things in a very oblique way. So when you get that strange feeling when you break up with somebody, or maybe you actually two-time somebody and you really kind of like it, the law and economics are not going to help you to understand these things. What might help you understand that is going to see a Shakespeare play, or listening to a rap record, or something, where somebody is trying to understand these things in a much more oblique way. And I see that art is a very oblique thing. It's not direct at all, and it takes sometimes years for it to work. And so all these other positivistic frameworks, the economic and legal frameworks that we have for understanding it, are very, very limited. They're very narrow and they're very imprecise, and that's a problem. So I really wish we could go. I nearly said go back, go forward or go sideways into some other way of talking about art, because talking about creative industries and cultural industries and creative cities is very limiting. The other thing that's limiting as well is the university system. I think that we've also developed when I left college, you just used to be an artist when you left college, and now you do an MA, and then you do a PhD, and then you do a fellowship, and the university system is fantastic for all sorts of things. But
for getting an artist.
Well, it's a very interesting way to limit the potential for art, because it demands certain kinds of transparency which art doesn't have, because it's an oblique way of thinking. So I think this is another problem that has sort of grown up alongside this instrumentalization of creativity and cultural practice, which is its academicization.
Yeah. That would definitely be a good topic for another interview.
A future interview. Bye.
But hey, thanks a lot.
That's okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Cheers.